Grandma, why do I have Indian status and Cousin Lucas doesn't?
That's a good question, Sarah. Lucas doesn't have Indian status because your Aunt Nadine's father and one of her grandmothers don't have Indian status. So none of Steve and Nadine's kids do.
But that's so unfair.
It sure is. Your Uncle Bob's father doesn't have Indian status, and his grandfather married out. But those cousins all have status.
Why?
Because Bob's grandfather married out before 1985. Before 1985, that meant that Bob's grandmother became an Indian.
Really?
Really.
Who made up these rules?
The government of Canada, Sarah. And it used to be worse.
How much worse?
You have to go back to before Europeans came to Canada. Back then, each First Nation had its own territory, culture, and rules for determining who was and wasn't a member, based on family relationships. Women and men had different but equally respected roles. When First Nations signed treaties with Canada, treaty rights were for all their descendants, for their families. There was no such thing as a status or non-status Indian.
Why did that change?
Starting in 1869, the government decided who was or wasn't an Indian. In 1876, the Indian Act extended the government's control.
My great-grandparents were both from First Nations. They had 4 kids, 3 boys and a girl. According to the Indian Act, the kids were all status Indians.
2 of the kids married non-First Nations people.
The children who had a First Nations father were status Indians, but the children who had a First Nations mother weren't.
But they were the same family.
Women who lost their Indian status through marriage couldn't even visit their parents on the reserve, unless they had permission from the Indian agent. That happened to my grandma. It tore the family apart. Her brother's wife wasn't First Nations, yet she was given Indian status.
You could lose your Indian status for other reasons, like if you got a university degree, or became a doctor, or lived outside of Canada for more than 5 years.
Your Bannock is amazing. Why did the government do that to First Nations people?
They believed that we were primitive, and they weren't, and that we needed to be like them.
They tried to take away our land, our languages, our cultures, our families, our communities.
But we didn't let them.
First Nations women fought against losing status if they married out, and more of First Nations leadership joined them. But it was a long process. Big changes didn't come until the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms became law in 1985. The Charter made discrimination by government illegal.
The government had to change the Indian Act. Women no longer lost their status by marrying a non-status man, and women who had lost their status that way could have it reinstated. So could their children. Suddenly, there were thousands more status Indians, but government funding for First Nations didn't increase by anywhere near as much.
The new act created 2 kinds of status, 6-1 and 6-2. 6-1 meant both your parents had status. 6-2 meant that one parent did.
If a 6-2 had children with a non-status person, their kids didn't have status.
That's why Cousin Lucas doesn't have status.
The 2 categories created a different kind of problem. Even today, many First Nations people think that if you're 6-1, you qualify for more services and benefits than if you're 6-2. So sometimes 6-2 people are discriminated against.
Another problem is that after 1985, band membership and Indian status were separate systems. So a person with status might not be a member of their parents' band. On the other hand, some bands give membership to children or grandchildren who don't have status. But the federal government only funds the band for status members.
So there was still discrimination.
Most of all, if a man had married a non-status woman before 1985, she was 6-1 under the new rules, and so were their children, which meant that all their grandchildren would have status. But if a status woman had married a non-status man before 1985, their children were 6 too, and their grandchildren might not have status at all.
Which is why a First Nations woman named Sharon McIver took the government to court in 1987.
Sharon lost status when she married a non-status man before 1985. She was reinstated after 1985. Her son Jacob got 6-2 status, but his kids couldn't because Jacob's wife was non-status. Yet Sharon's brother married a non-status woman before 1985, so Jacob's cousins got 6-1 status, which meant they could pass on their status, even if one of their parents was non-status.
Because Sharon won her case, eventually, the government had to change the Indian Act again in 2010, so that people like Jacob would get 6-1 status like their cousins.
So finally it was fair.
Not so fast, Sarah.
The changes in 2010 helped people who were being unfairly treated in the way Sharon was. But unfortunately, the government limited it to people who were born after 1951.
Why 1951?
And then in 2015, 3 members of the Abenakis of Odanak First Nation challenged the new Indian Act and won. This was the problem. When Sharon McIver won her case, her grandchildren born after 1985 got 6-2 status. But Indian men who'd married non-status women before 1985 and whose sons also married non-status women before 1985 had 6-1 grandchildren and even status great-grandchildren. But their sisters who married non-status men didn't. The government had to make changes to treat male and female grandchildren born before 1985 the same.
And to end discrimination against daughters compared to sons born to unmarried Indian men and non-Indian women.
That's so complicated. What status do you have?
I'm 6'2".
And I'm 6'1".
And what am I?
You're 6'1", Sarah.
So the Indian Act is fair now, right?
There are still serious problems. Think of why Cousin Lucas and his siblings don't have status. If First Nations don't fight to change that second-generation cutoff rule, within 3 generations, 1 in 3 people whose ancestors had status in 2005 will have lost it. There will be fewer and fewer status Indians.
All of the problems we've talked about have the same cause, Sarah. The Indian Act has the government deciding who is and isn't First Nations. That's a decision we should be making, and we have to be making so we can become self-governing and sustainable. And it's already happening.
Grandma, this all looks so good.
My mother taught me, Sarah. She loved to feed people.
Thanks for telling me all this. I feel even prouder to belong to a First Nation.